Nathaniel Carter sat in his cramped one-bedroom apartment, a paint-streaked palette resting on his lap as the sun filtered through the thin curtains. The room was a symphony of chaos, canvases stacked against the walls, brushes and coffee mugs, and countless unfinished pieces scattered across every available surface. Despite the disorder, it was his sanctuary, the only place where he felt truly free. Nathaniel had poured his soul onto every canvas, each brushstroke a testament to his passion and pain. But outside these walls, his work was invisible. Nathaniel had grown up in a neighborhood where dreams were often crushed under the weight of poverty and prejudice. From a young age, he had shown a talent for drawing, sketching scenes from his imagination and his reality, sometimes blending the two in ways that startled his teachers and family. Yet, talent was not enough in a world that saw him as a statistic rather than an artist. Every rejection letter he received from galleries stung like a fresh wound. "We regret to inform you," was a phrase that seemed to echo endlessly in his mind. The few times he had been granted an audience with gallery owners, they either dismissed him with polite indifference or criticized his work as unmarketable. To Nathaniel, it was clear that they didn't see the value in his art because they didn't see value in him. But Nathaniel was resilient. He spent his days working odd jobs, delivering packages, painting houses, and bartending, to fund his passion. At night, he painted feverishly, his hands moving with a determination that defied his exhaustion. He painted stories of his people, of struggle and triumph, of beauty and pain. His art was raw, evocative, and unapologetically authentic. One rainy afternoon, Nathaniel decided to take a bold step. He had heard of the Rosemont Gallery, a prestigious establishment in the heart of the city known for its exclusive clientele and eye-watering price tags. The gallery's owner, Julian Hayes, was a figure of considerable influence in the art world. He was also notorious for his elitist attitude and disdain for what he deemed unsophisticated art. Nathaniel spent days preparing for the meeting. He carefully selected his best pieces, paintings that told stories of joy and anguish, of hope and resilience. He dressed in his best clothes, a simple but clean shirt and blazer that had seen better days, and carried his portfolio under his arm as he stepped into the grand halls of Rosemont Gallery. The gallery was as intimidating as he had imagined, its marble floors gleaming under chandeliers and its walls adorned with abstract pieces that screamed wealth and exclusivity. Nathaniel approached the front desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The receptionist, a young woman with an air of detached professionalism, raised an eyebrow as he introduced himself and requested to see Julian Hayes. After a long wait, Julian appeared, his tailored suit and polished demeanor exuding confidence and superiority. He was a man who carried himself with the assurance of someone who believed he held the keys to the kingdom. Nathaniel introduced himself and presented his portfolio, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. Julian flipped through the portfolio with the same disinterest one might reserve for junk mail. His lips curled into a faint smirk as he closed it and handed it back to Nathaniel. "This isn't the kind of work we display here," Julian said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's too raw. Lacks refinement. Our clientele expects a certain level of sophistication, and frankly, this doesn't meet that standard." Nathaniel felt the sting of Julian's words, but he refused to let it show on his face. "Art is supposed to evoke emotion," he said, his voice firm. "My work tells stories that people need to hear." Julian chuckled, a cold and hollow sound. "Emotion is fine, but it doesn't sell. Perhaps you should try your luck at community art fairs or street exhibits. That's more your audience, don't you think?" The words cut deep, but Nathaniel stood his ground. He gathered his portfolio, thanked Julian for his time, and walked out of the gallery with his head held high. As he stepped into the rain-soaked streets, he vowed that one day, the world would see the value in his work, even if the Julian Hayeses of the world couldn't. This moment, though painful, became a turning point for Nathaniel. The rejection lit a fire within him, a determination to prove that his art was not only valuable, but essential. And while Julian Hayes saw only an artist destined to fade into obscurity, Nathaniel saw a future where his name would be impossible to ignore. Nathaniel Carter stood under the overcast sky on a bustling city street, his makeshift exhibit set up in a corner of the neighborhood market. His paintings hung from a wire frame he had borrowed from a friend, each piece lovingly positioned to catch the attention of passers-by. The rain from earlier that morning had left puddles along the sidewalk, and the air carried the scent of damp asphalt and roasted peanuts from a nearby vendor. This wasn't where Nathaniel wanted his art to be, not on a street corner, surrounded by the chaos of honking horns and haggling vendors, but it was the only place that would have him. With galleries like Rosemont slamming their doors in his face, he had decided to take matters into his own hands. If the elite art world wouldn't accept him, he would bring his art to the people. For hours, he stood quietly by his display, answering questions from curious onlookers and enduring the occasional dismissive glance. Some admired his work but quickly moved on, unwilling to spend money on art when groceries were their priority. Others lingered, captivated by the vivid colors and raw emotion in his pieces. Nathaniel's work spoke of resilience, identity, and struggle in ways that resonated deeply with those who took the time to see it. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, a woman approached his display. She was tall and striking, her silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon and her sharp eyes scanning the paintings with an intensity that made Nathaniel's heart race. She wore a tailored coat and carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to making important decisions. The woman stopped in front of a piece titled Echoes of Silence, a haunting depiction of a young boy standing in the ruins of a crumbling neighborhood. She studied it for a long moment before turning to Nathaniel. "Did you paint this?" she asked, her voice crisp but not unkind. "Yes, ma'am," Nathaniel replied, trying to keep his tone steady. Her eyes flicked back to the painting. "It's remarkable. The composition, the emotion, it's as though the canvas itself is alive." Nathaniel felt a surge of hope but tempered it with caution. "Thank you. I try to tell stories that feel real, that people can connect with." The woman extended her hand. "Margaret Delacroix. I'm an art critic and curator." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. Margaret Delacroix was a name he had heard many times, a titan in the art world known for discovering and championing emerging talent. She had a reputation for being discerning and uncompromising, and her endorsement could make or break an artist's career. Margaret gestured to the rest of his display. "Your work has a rawness that's missing in most of what I see these days. I think the world needs to see it. Would you be interested in exhibiting at the Eastview International Art Fair?" For a moment, Nathaniel could only stare at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't joke about art," Margaret said with a faint smile. "I'll cover the costs of getting your work showcased. All I need is for you to say yes." Nathaniel's heart pounded as he nodded. "Yes. Absolutely, yes." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Margaret helped him prepare for the fair, ensuring his work was professionally framed and displayed. She introduced him to collectors, critics, and gallery owners, many of whom had never heard his name but were immediately captivated by his talent. When the day of the art fair arrived, Nathaniel found himself standing in a grand exhibition hall filled with some of the most prestigious names in the industry. His booth, tucked between two well-established artists, was modest but powerful. The paintings spoke for themselves, each one telling a story that demanded to be heard. The response was overwhelming. Visitors crowded around his display, their expressions a mix of awe and emotion. Some were moved to tears by his depictions of resilience and community, while others were captivated by the bold colors and intricate details. By the end of the first day, several pieces had already sold for staggering sums, with one collector paying over $500,000 for Echoes of Silence. The buzz around Nathaniel's work spread like wildfire. Articles in major art publications hailed him as the voice of a generation and a visionary artist redefining the narrative of modern art. Margaret, true to her reputation, championed him at every turn, ensuring his work received the recognition it deserved. Within weeks, Nathaniel's paintings were selling for millions. Galleries that had once ignored him were now clamoring to represent him, their owners suddenly eager to showcase the very work they had dismissed as unmarketable. But Nathaniel didn't forget how they had treated him. Instead, he focused on building relationships with those who had believed in him from the start. Overnight, Nathaniel Carter became a celebrated artist, his name synonymous with authenticity and brilliance. His journey from the streets to the heights of the art world was an inspiration, a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of staying true to oneself. As Nathaniel stood on the stage of the Eastview Art Fair, accepting an award for Best Emerging Artist, he looked out at the crowd of influential figures who now admired his work. He thought of all the times he had been told he wasn't good enough, of the dismissive words from Julian Hayes and others like him. But those voices no longer mattered. Nathaniel had found his place, and the world was finally listening. Months had passed since Nathaniel Carter's meteoric rise in the art world. His name had become synonymous with success, with his paintings gracing the walls of the world's most prestigious galleries and fetching sums that few could imagine. Yet, despite the fame, Nathaniel remained grounded. He had not forgotten the people and experiences that had shaped him, nor the pain of rejection that had once threatened to drown his dreams. One afternoon, as Nathaniel perused the latest art auction catalog, he came across a piece that caught his eye, an abstract painting by a famed artist he had always admired, now up for sale at Rosemont Gallery. It was a rare opportunity to add a significant piece to his collection, but there was something more he was after. He had made a name for himself as an artist, but now, he was also becoming a savvy investor, seeking to buy art that would appreciate in value over time. Nathaniel knew exactly where to go. Rosemont Gallery, the very institution that had turned him away, was now a place he could afford to enter, not just as an artist, but as a potential buyer. He had the power now, but his reasons for returning were more than just a transaction. There was something personal about this visit, a chance to return to the very place that had mocked him and prove just how far he had come. He dressed carefully, donning a tailored suit that radiated confidence and success. His OES were polished, and his watch gleamed in the light. Nathaniel knew the value of presentation. He had learned that the hard way, but he wasn't about to let his attire mask the deeper purpose of this visit. When he arrived at Rosemont, the gallery still looked every bit as pristine and exclusive as it had the first time he laid eyes on it. The marble floors gleamed, and the walls were adorned with works that whispered of untouchable wealth. Nathaniel paused at the entrance for a moment, taking it all in, before stepping through the glass doors. The receptionist greeted him with a polite but distant smile, the same woman who had been behind the desk when he first came here, years ago. She didn't recognize him at first, and Nathaniel didn't bother to correct her. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Julian Hayes," he said smoothly. "Of course, sir," she replied, her tone still cool. "I'll let him know you're here." Nathaniel stood in the sleek, minimalist lobby, taking in the atmosphere of the gallery with a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. He didn't have to wait long. Julian Hayes emerged from behind a set of double doors, dressed in his signature impeccable suit. His eyes flickered over Nathaniel for a moment before recognition clicked into place. "You again," Julian said, a faint sneer twisting his lips. "I thought I told you before that Rosemont isn't the place for your kind of art." Nathaniel held back a smile, his hands resting calmly at his sides. "I'm not here about my art today," he said, his voice even. "I've come to discuss a potential purchase." Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A purchase, eh? I hope you've come to your senses. There's quite a selection of fine works here, but you might find the prices a bit steep for your taste. We cater to a very particular clientele." His voice was laced with condescension, as though Nathaniel didn't belong in such a space. Nathaniel gave a slight nod, acknowledging the subtle jab, but remained composed. "I'm aware of the prices, Mr. Hayes. That's precisely why I'm here. I'm interested in making a significant investment." Julian, clearly not expecting such an assertion, glanced at Nathaniel with an air of disbelief. "Oh? Well, I suppose I'll have to show you a few pieces. But if you're looking for a bargain, you're in the wrong place." We don't do discounts for newcomers. Nathaniel followed Julian through the gallery, walking past the expensive works that now seemed out of place in the context of his success. He had seen these pieces before, rich, abstract landscapes and portraits of aloof aristocrats. The world Julian inhabited was one of exclusivity and privilege, but Nathaniel had no intention of buying into that. Julian led him to a section of the gallery displaying a number of high-profile works, but Nathaniel wasn't looking at the art. He was studying Julian's demeanor, noting how the gallery owner's tone shifted from smug to dismissive. Especially when talking about the prices and the clientele they catered to. Julian was still holding on to the belief that Nathaniel was some kind of aspiring artist, someone who didn't belong in the world of multimillion-dollar acquisitions. The moment came when Julian walked him over to the painting he had been eyeing, a large, colorful abstract that had been the subject of a recent buzz in the art world. The price tag was exorbitant, but Nathaniel had the means to afford it, and then some. Julian paused, expecting the usual response from someone of Nathaniel's presumed status: shock, hesitation, or perhaps a flustered attempt to negotiate. Instead, Nathaniel turned to Julian, his expression calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'll take it," he said simply. Julian blinked, momentarily thrown off by the confidence in Nathaniel's voice. He laughed lightly, thinking perhaps Nathaniel was trying to feign interest in order to save face. "You've got a keen eye, but I think you're out of your depth here. This is a piece for people who understand fine art, not someone looking for a trendy acquisition." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he replied, his voice steady. Julian chuckled again, shaking his head. "Well, if you're serious about buying, I'll need to know who you are. I can't just sell to anyone who walks in off the street." He grabbed a tablet from the desk, ready to input Nathaniel's details. Nathaniel looked at Julian with a small smile. "I think you already know who I am, Mr. Hayes." Julian's fingers froze over the screen. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice losing its previous confidence. Nathaniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black card, placing it on the counter with deliberate slowness. The card was embossed with his name in gold lettering: Nathaniel Carter, artist and collector. Julian's eyes went wide as he processed the name. "Wait. Nathaniel Carter? The artist?" His voice faltered, his previously dismissive expression replaced by shock and a trace of panic. Nathaniel nodded. "The one and only." For a long moment, the gallery owner stood frozen, the weight of his earlier mockery now crashing down on him. His face drained of color as he realized the gravity of the situation. Nathaniel was not a mere patron, he was the very artist whose work Julian had belittled, rejected, and dismissed not so long ago. The silence between them was deafening. Nathaniel stood there, calm and composed, as Julian struggled to find his words. I didn't realize," Julian stammered, his usual bravado gone. "No, you didn't," Nathaniel replied softly. "And now, I'm the one buying the art." Julian cleared his throat, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. I must apologize for my earlier behavior. It was unprofessional, and I'm sure I misunderstood your intentions," he trailed off, unsure of what else to say. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "It's not just about the art, Julian. It's about respect. You didn't see my value then, but you do now." He glanced at the painting again, then back at Julian. "I'm here to buy, but it's more than just a transaction. It's a reminder of the power of perseverance and belief in one's self." Julian, now visibly shaken, nodded rapidly. "Of course. Thank you for your understanding. I'll make sure everything is taken care of immediately." Nathaniel gave him a small nod, turning to walk away. As he left the gallery, the weight of the moment settled within him. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. The tables had turned, and for once, it was Nathaniel who held the power. Nathaniel Carter couldn't help but smile as he walked through the halls of Rosemont Gallery, a place that had once turned him away, a place that had mocked the very essence of his work. Now, it was his. It had been a few weeks since that unforgettable encounter with Julian Hayes, when the gallery owner had been blindsided by the realization that Nathaniel was no longer the struggling artist he had dismissed so easily. But Nathaniel had done more than simply purchase a painting or make a statement. He had purchased the entire gallery. And in doing so, he had ensured that his vision, the vision that had always been larger than the confines of his canvas, would have a lasting impact. The process of acquiring Rosemont had been quick, but it hadn't been easy. Nathaniel had never imagined himself as a buyer of a prestigious gallery, but the more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. Rosemont's reputation for exclusivity and elitism had always been a part of the art world Nathaniel despised, but in the wake of his own success, he realized that he could reshape that world. He could open doors for artists who, like him, had been turned away. He had come full circle. No longer a hopeful artist looking for validation, Nathaniel was now an owner, a mentor, and an advocate for underrepresented talent. His decision to buy Rosemont wasn't driven by ego, but by a deep-seated belief that art was meant to be shared, not hoarded. The media quickly caught wind of the acquisition. Nathaniel's story was a sensational one, the black artist who had been rejected by the same gallery he now owned. Headlines blared across the country, turning his story into one of triumph and defiance against an industry that had long excluded marginalized voices. Art critics who had once ignored him were now singing his praises, recognizing not just his art but his vision for the future of the gallery world. The shift at Rosemont was immediate. Nathaniel wasted no time making his presence known. The walls of the gallery, which had once been dominated by the works of established, often exclusionary artists, were soon lined with fresh, bold pieces from artists of color, queer artists, women, and those whose stories had often been overlooked by the mainstream art world. Nathaniel transformed Rosemont into a sanctuary for talent that had been marginalized. He introduced rotating exhibitions that focused on underrepresented voices, creating an inclusive space where diversity was not just celebrated but amplified. His goal was not to erase the legacy of the past, but to build upon it, to take the exclusivity that had once defined the gallery and transform it into a platform for the unheard. The first major exhibition Nathaniel curated was titled Voices Unheard, and it featured emerging artists from all over the world. It was a massive success, drawing attention from collectors and critics alike. The media buzzed about the new direction the gallery was taking, with many praising Nathaniel for giving a voice to those who had long been ignored. The artists whose work was showcased in that first exhibit were now household names, and Rosemont became a beacon of change in the art world. But the real transformation was not just in the art. Nathaniel, despite his newfound success, had always believed in giving back. He offered mentorship programs, hosted workshops, and created scholarships for young artists who had the talent but not the means to pursue their craft. Rosemont wasn't just a gallery, it was a movement. And yet, even as the gallery flourished under his leadership, the story of his acquisition of Rosemont didn't sit well with everyone. Julian Hayes, the former owner, quickly became a target of public criticism. His past behavior was scrutinized, his elitism and dismissiveness laid bare for all to see. The art world that had once turned a blind eye to his actions now saw him for what he truly was, a man who had profited from exclusion and had almost destroyed a talent like Nathaniel's. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Galleries and collectors who had once supported Julian now distanced themselves from him, afraid that their association with the disgraced former owner would damage their reputations. The media painted Julian as a symbol of everything wrong with the traditional art world, a gatekeeper who had built his empire by keeping others out. Nathaniel, ever the professional, knew that public shaming was not enough to drive home the lesson he hoped to teach. He had experienced the sting of rejection and had risen above it. Instead of demanding Julian's complete ousting from the art world, Nathaniel saw an opportunity for redemption, not just for himself, but for Julian. It was a chilly afternoon when Nathaniel reached out to Julian for the first time since their fateful encounter. He had heard that Julian was now in a state of quiet desperation, struggling to find work in the art world that had once embraced him. Nathaniel had spent a long time thinking about how to approach the situation. He could easily have dismissed Julian, but that wouldn't serve his higher purpose. He believed in second chances, and he believed in teaching humility. Julian was reluctant when Nathaniel's assistant called to schedule a meeting. He had no idea what to expect, but he certainly wasn't prepared for what Nathaniel had in mind. When they met in person, Julian looked thinner, more disheveled than Nathaniel had ever seen him. There was a kind of defeated energy in the air as he sat down, clearly uncomfortable in Nathaniel's presence. "Mr. Hayes," Nathaniel said with calm authority, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." Julian's face tightened, his eyes wary. "I'm sure you have, Mr. Carter. I understand if you want nothing to do with me. I didn't know who you were when you first came to the gallery. I was wrong. I didn't see the potential." His voice faltered. "I've made a lot of mistakes." Nathaniel studied him for a moment, seeing the man for what he was, a product of a system that valued exclusivity over inclusivity, and a man who had let his own arrogance cloud his judgment. "You did make mistakes, Julian. But I'm not here to tear you down. I'm here to offer you a chance to learn from them." Julian's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I'm offering you a job," Nathaniel said, leaning forward slightly. "A position here at Rosemont. Not as a curator, not as an artist. As a member of my team, someone who will help mentor the artists who come through here. Someone who can teach humility, because that's what this place is about now. Respect. For everyone. You'll be working with underrepresented artists, and you'll see firsthand the kind of talent that deserves a voice." Julian's eyes widened in disbelief. "You want me to work here? After everything?" Nathaniel nodded. "You've been given a second chance, just like everyone else. You can either remain bitter and resentful, or you can prove that you've learned something. I believe in redemption, Julian. It's not too late for you." The silence between them was thick, but Julian's shoulders slumped as the weight of Nathaniel's words settled in. Finally, he spoke. I don't know if I deserve it. But I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Nathaniel smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. "That's all I ask." And so, Julian Hayes returned to Rosemont Gallery, but not as its owner, not as its star. He worked under Nathaniel, learning the lessons of humility and respect. Over time, his attitude shifted, and while the road to redemption was not always easy, Julian began to understand the true value of art, not in its exclusivity or its price tag, but in its power to speak for those who had been silenced. Nathaniel had not only reclaimed the gallery but had turned it into a symbol of transformation, a reminder that respect, empathy, and opportunity were the true foundations of greatness. And in the process, he had taught a man who had once dismissed him a lesson he would never forget. Nathaniel Carter stood in front of the large floor-to-ceiling windows of Rosemont Gallery, looking out over the bustling city below. The world seemed so different now, brighter, fuller, more alive. The once closed doors of the art world were now wide open, and Nathaniel had been the one to pry them open. He leaned against the cool glass, a deep sense of gratitude and peace settling over him as he reflected on his journey. The road had been long, filled with obstacles, setbacks, and painful rejections. There had been days when Nathaniel had doubted himself, wondering if his dreams of being an artist, of making a real impact, were just too far out of reach. He had poured every ounce of his being into his art, and yet, the world had not always been kind. Galleries had turned him away. Critics had dismissed him. Julian Hayes, a man who embodied the kind of elitism and gatekeeping that had defined the art world, had once looked at his work with disdain. But Nathaniel had never given up. He had kept painting, kept dreaming, and kept pushing against the tide. And now, as he stood in the very gallery that had once rejected him, Nathaniel felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The journey had not only been about his own success, but about something much larger, about changing the landscape of the art world, about giving a platform to those who had long been overlooked and excluded. He had made a promise to himself when he bought Rosemont Gallery, that he would turn it into a space for the unheard, for artists who had been silenced by the mainstream art world. And he had done just that. The gallery had evolved into a cultural hub, a sanctuary where talent and diversity were not only celebrated but amplified. It was a place where emerging artists from all walks of life could find the recognition and respect they deserved. Nathaniel's commitment to making the art world more inclusive had resonated with artists and collectors alike, and Rosemont had become a symbol of change, a beacon of hope for those who had been marginalized. The gallery was a vibrant mosaic of colors, voices, and stories. Each exhibition told a story of resilience, of culture, of life. The walls were adorned with works from artists of every race, gender, and background, artists who had once struggled to find space in the art world but who now found a home at Rosemont. There were powerful portraits of Black identity, abstract pieces that explored the complexities of the queer experience, intricate sculptures that challenged perceptions of beauty and form. Nathaniel had curated exhibitions that focused on indigenous art, art from immigrants, and art that tackled social justice issues. Every piece was a reflection of the diversity of the world around him. Rosemont was no longer just a gallery, it was a movement. It was a testament to the power of art to create change, to amplify voices, and to make a difference. And Nathaniel had been at the heart of it all, shaping the future of the art world with every decision he made. His name had become synonymous with not just artistic talent but with a vision for a more inclusive and compassionate world. As the grand reopening of the newly transformed gallery approached, Nathaniel felt a sense of full circle. This was the moment he had been working toward his entire life. This was the culmination of every rejection, every struggle, every sleepless night spent painting in his cramped apartment. He had made it, not just for himself, but for every artist who had ever been told they didn't belong. On the night of the reopening, the gallery was buzzing with energy. The grand space was filled with guests, artists, collectors, critics, and patrons of the arts, all gathered to celebrate the new direction Rosemont had taken. The walls were lined with pieces that had taken years to create, stories that had never been told in this space before. There was an air of excitement in the room, a palpable sense that something big was happening. Nathaniel stood at the center of it all, looking out over the crowd. The faces before him were diverse, not just in appearance, but in their stories, in the challenges they had overcome to be here. He felt a deep sense of pride in what he had built, but also a quiet humility. He knew that none of this would have been possible without the unwavering support of the artists who had believed in him, without the trust of those who had given him a chance when the world had told him to quit. As the evening wore on, Nathaniel was invited to the stage. The room grew quiet as he stepped up to the podium, his heart racing just slightly. He had spoken at many events before, but this was different. This was his moment to reflect on everything he had accomplished and to share his journey with those who had been part of it. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady and full of conviction. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for celebrating not just the reopening of Rosemont Gallery, but the vision that has shaped this place into what it is today. This gallery is a reflection of the world I believe we can create, a world where every voice matters, where art is a means of connection, not division. He paused for a moment, looking around the room at the faces before him, faces of artists, supporters, critics, and friends. I remember a time when I was told that my art wasn't worthy of a space like this, that I wasn't worthy of being here. I was told my work was too raw, too unrefined, that it didn't belong in the elite circles of the art world. I was told that I would never make it. But I'm standing here today, not as someone who was lucky, but as someone who refused to give up. I'm here because I believed in my art, and more importantly, I believed in myself. The room was silent. Every person hanging on his words. Nathaniel's gaze swept over the crowd, his voice growing stronger. I've always believed that art is about more than just what's on the canvas. It's about telling stories. It's about giving people the opportunity to see the world through someone else's eyes. And that's what this gallery is all about, giving space to voices that have been silenced, to stories that have been ignored, to perspectives that have been overlooked. He smiled, a quiet, contented smile that spoke of the journey he had taken, of the struggles that had shaped him into the man he had become. This gallery, and the work we're doing here, isn't just for the art world. It's for everyone. It's for the artists who have been told they weren't good enough. It's for the people who have been told they don't belong. It's for the dreamers, the outcasts, the rebels who refuse to be ignored. I want Rosemont to be a place where every artist, no matter their background, can find a home. A place where their work is seen, heard, and valued. A place where their stories can be told. The crowd broke into applause, and Nathaniel felt a rush of emotion flood through him. The journey had been hard, but it had been worth every struggle, every rejection, every setback. He had made it, they had made it, and this moment was a testament to the power of perseverance, to the belief that anything was possible if you refused to give up. As I stand here tonight, Nathaniel continued, I'm reminded of why I started this journey in the first place. It wasn't for the fame, or the accolades, or the money. It was for the chance to make a difference. To show the world that art belongs to everyone, that every voice has a place in the conversation. And I'm proud to say that, together, we've built something that will last. This gallery is just the beginning. The applause grew louder, and Nathaniel felt the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't just about Rosemont, it was about everything he had overcome to get here. It was about every artist who had ever been told they weren't enough, about every dreamer who had been dismissed and overlooked. Nathaniel had proved that they, too, could make their mark on the world. As the cheers echoed around him, Nathaniel realized that his journey had come full circle. He had come from the shadows, from the rejection and ridicule, to stand at the center of it all, not as someone who had been chosen by the elite, but as someone who had chosen himself. And in doing so, he had created a space where every artist could do the same.